the weight of what we carry. The room smelled like old wood and stale cigarette smoke. It was late, somewhere past midnight in New York City, 1964. The kind of hour when the city quiets just enough that you can hear your own breathing. John Lennon sat alone in a dim corner of a studio lounge, guitar resting against the wall beside him. His eyes were red, not from exhaustion, but from something heavier. He'd been drinking, but not enough to drown it. Just enough to soften the edges of a grief he didn't know how to name. Outside, thousands of people were screaming his name. The Beatles were everywhere. Every radio station, every magazine cover, every conversation, and every home in America. But in that room, in that quiet, John wasn't thinking about the screaming. He was thinking about a man he'd never met, a man who'd been dead for 11 years. Hank Williams. The name had come up earlier that night in conversation with a session musician, an older man from Nashville who'd played steel guitar on some of Hank's final recordings. The man had mentioned it casually, almost in passing, the way you mention weather or traffic. But something in the way he said it, something in the reverence mixed with sadness, had stayed with John. He couldn't shake it. He was 29, the musician had said. Same age you are now. John hadn't responded. He'd just nodded, let the words settle, and excused himself to this room. Now he sat with that number repeating in his head. 29. The same age. The same pressure. The same crushing, endless demand to be something more than human while the world watched and waited for you to crack. Hank Williams had cracked. John knew that much. Everyone knew that much. The drinking, the pills, the back pain that turned into addiction, the loneliness that ate him alive even when he was surrounded by people who adored him. Hank had died alone in the back of a Cadillac on New Year's Day, 1953, his body giving out before his voice ever could. He'd left behind songs that would outlive everyone who ever heard them, but he hadn't lived to see it. John thought about that, about leaving something behind, about whether it mattered if you weren't there to witness it. He reached for the guitar. His fingers found the strings without thinking, muscle memory guiding him into a melody he didn't recognize at first. Slow, aching. The kind of tune that felt like it had always existed, waiting for someone to pull it out of the air. He didn't sing. He just played, letting the sound fill the silence, letting it say what he couldn't. The door opened. Paul McCartney stood in the doorway, hesitant. He didn't speak right away. He knew John well enough to recognize the look on his face, the weight in his posture. This wasn't the time for jokes or small talk. This was the time to either stay silent or say something that mattered. "You all right?" Paul asked quietly. John didn't look up. "Do you ever think about what happens when it's over?" Paul frowned, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "When what's over?" "This." John gestured vaguely at the room, at the walls, at the world beyond them. All of it. The screaming, the songs, the whole bloody circus. Paul sat down across from him, arms folded, listening. "I was thinking about Hank Williams," John continued. "That bloke who played steel guitar tonight, he knew him. Said Hank was 29 when he died. Same as me." Paul didn't respond immediately. He understood where this was going. "He wrote songs that'll last forever," John said, his voice low, almost bitter. "But he never got to hear people sing them back to him. He was gone before any of it mattered. And I keep thinking, what's the point? What's the bloody point of any of this if it just eats you alive?" Paul shifted uncomfortably. "You're not Hank Williams, John." "No," John agreed. "But I could be." The words hung in the air like smoke. Paul wanted to argue. He wanted to tell John he was being dramatic, that he was letting the pressure get to him, that this was just the price of success. But he couldn't. because deep down, Paul knew the same fear. He felt it too, that gnawing sense that fame was a machine, and they were just fuel, that eventually the machine would consume them, and no amount of brilliance or talent would matter. The only question was how long they could last. Hank didn't have what we have, Paul said finally. He was alone. We've got each other. John looked at him, his expression unreadable. Do we? Paul didn't answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the building, the distant rumble of traffic outside, the quiet creak of the guitar against the wall. Then, John picked up the guitar again. This time, he played something different, something familiar, a Hank Williams song, "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." He sang it softly, almost to himself. His voice wasn't polished. It cracked in places, rough around the edges, raw in a way his Beatles vocals never were. But it was real. It was honest. And Paul listened, watching his friend pour something out that he couldn't name, something that had been building for months, maybe years. When the song ended, John set the guitar down and rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't want to die like that," he said quietly. "I don't want to be a ghost people talk about like some tragic bloody legend. I want to be here. I want to see what it all becomes." Paul nodded. "Then we make sure you do." It sounded simple. It sounded like a promise. But both of them knew it wasn't that easy. The world didn't care about promises. The world wanted what it wanted, and it didn't stop until it got it. Across town, in a record shop that stayed open late, a young clerk was flipping through vinyl records in the back room. He was supposed to be organizing inventory, but he'd gotten distracted by an old Hank Williams compilation someone had traded in earlier that week. He'd heard of Hank before, of course. Everyone had. But he'd never really listened. He put the record on. The first song that played was "Your Cheatin' Heart." Slow. Mournful. Heartbreaking in a way that felt almost too personal, like eavesdropping on someone's private grief. The clerk stood there, frozen, as Hank's voice filled the room. There was something in it that hit harder than anything he'd heard in a long time. It wasn't just sadness. It was acceptance. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly how the story ended and sang it anyway. He thought about the Beatles, about how different they were, how loud and electric and alive. But underneath all of that, underneath the screaming and the energy, he wondered if they felt the same thing Hank felt, if they carried the same weight. He wondered if anyone who made music that mattered ever got to feel light. Back in the studio lounge, John and Paul sat in silence. The guitar was back against the wall. The room was darker now, the lights dimmed to almost nothing. "Do you think he knew?" John asked suddenly. Knew what? That he mattered. That people would remember him. Paul thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not." "I hope he did," John said. "I hope he at least had that." Paul wanted to say something comforting, something wise. But he didn't have the words. So he just sat there, present, solid, the only kind of support he knew how to give. Eventually, John stood up. He stretched, rolled his shoulders, let out a long breath. "I need to write something," he said. "Something that lasts. Not just another pop song. Something real." Paul stood too. "You will." "How do you know?" "Because you already have. You just don't see it yet." John looked at him. Skeptical, but softened. "You always know what to say, don't you?" Paul smiled faintly. "Not always. But I try." They left the room together, stepping back into the bright, chaotic world of cameras and schedules and expectations. But something had shifted. Something small, but significant. A recognition that they were walking the same path Hank Williams had walked, but they didn't have to walk it alone. And maybe that was the only difference that mattered. Years later, after John was gone, after the world had lost him too soon just like it lost Hank, people would talk about this night. They would speculate about what was said, what was felt, what it meant. They would try to draw lines between the two men, to find connections in their music, their pain, their brilliance. But the truth was simpler than that. Both men had carried something too heavy to name. Both had tried to make sense of it through songs, and both had left behind echoes that outlived them. Melodies that would be sung long after the people who created them were gone. In 1964, John Lennon didn't know how his story would end. He didn't know that he'd become the very thing he feared, a legend, a ghost, a voice frozen in time. But in that quiet room, late at night, he felt the weight of it. He felt the pull of something bigger than himself, something that demanded everything and gave nothing back except the hope that maybe, just maybe, it would mean something to someone. And maybe that was enough. The guitar sat silent against the wall. The room was empty again. But the sound of what had been played there lingered, hanging in the air like smoke, like memory, like the echo of a voice that refused to fade. Outside, the city kept moving. People kept screaming. The machine kept turning. But for one quiet moment, in the space between the noise, two men had sat together in the dark and acknowledged what they both knew, that greatness came with a cost. That fame was a fire that could warm you or burn you, and you didn't always get to choose. Hank Williams had burned. John Lennon would burn too, years later in a different way. But on that night, in that room, he was still here, still breathing, still holding the guitar, still trying to make sense of it all. And maybe that was the only victory that mattered. The next morning, the Beatles were back on stage. Thousands of people screamed. Cameras flashed. The world watched. John played. He sang. He smiled. But somewhere inside, he carried the weight of what he'd felt the night before. The connection to a man he'd never met. The understanding that they were part of the same story, separated by time, but bound by the same impossible burden. He didn't talk about it. He didn't write a song about it, not directly. But it was there, woven into everything he created after that night. A quiet reverence for the cost of making something beautiful. A respect for the ones who came before him and didn't survive it. And when he played, when he sang, when he poured himself into the music, he did it with the knowledge that this might be all that lasted. That the songs might outlive him. That one day, someone else might sit in a quiet room and think about him the way he thought about Hank. Not as a hero, not as a legend, just as a man who carried something heavy and tried to make it beautiful. The guitar stayed silent. The room stayed empty. But the music never stopped.